Hi, this is a short video to introduce you to qualitative research. My name is Meredith Vanstone, and I'm an associate professor and qualitative researcher in the Department of Family Medicine at McMaster University. So let's start by thinking about what you might already know about qualitative research or what might come to your mind when you think about qualitative research. If you're like most folks with limited exposure, you probably think about a focus group, like this group conversation, or an interview. And these are definitely two very common ways of collecting qualitative data. But qualitative research is a very diverse collection of approaches with many different ways about collecting data. So I'll give you a couple of examples just to sort of start us off. This is an image from ethnographic researcher Jenny Coburn. It shows two mothers, a Canadian researcher and a Quechua farmer, removing kernels of corn by hand from dried corn cobs. Their young children are accompanying them, and they're learning by participating even at this very young age. Corn is a staple of the Indian diet, and the corn that they're dehusking right now will be boiled or ground to make a variety of meals and drinks. So the kind of research that's going on here is participant observation. This is a very common form of data collection, particularly in ethnography or anthropology. And this gives the researcher a chance to experience daily life in a community, to build rapport, and in this case, as a participant, to even be of assistance to one of the participants in her study, to learn alongside while asking a range of questions and probably making some notes about the agricultural or food preparation practices, whatever she's studying here. Here's another example. This is a transcript of two people talking while watching television. So it's being analyzed as part of a conversation analysis project. And conversation analysis is an approach to studying social interaction. It embraces both verbal and nonverbal communication. And really, it started with a focus on casual conversation, but over a couple of decades, it's evolved to embrace more institutional and professionally focused conversations. And communication between physicians and patients is a very common topic of conversation analysis. It's probably worth also noting that the name of it, conversation analysis, is a bit of a misnomer these days because it really focuses on interaction between people, not just the verbal sort of conversation interaction. Another example of what qualitative research could be, this is a picture from a program called Children's Power Play. The program aims to encourage and empower 9 to 11-year-olds to eat the recommended amount of fruit and vegetables and get 60 minutes of physical activity every day. So one of the initiatives of this program was they conducted a photo voice research project where they gave the 9 to 11-year-olds some cameras and they asked them to take pictures of things that were relevant to the research project. The kids then came back and they shared their photos with the researchers. And as the researchers and the children looked at the photos together, the researchers were able to ask guiding questions about the kids' perspectives, opinions, and experiences. So this can be a very useful methodology when you're working with a group like children who maybe have a hard time sort of thinking about abstract ideas or articulating like a very long commentary or narrative of their life, but for whom they can make decisions about what's important to them and then photograph it, and then the photograph can kind of act as a catalyst for that conversation. And here they were doing this project because they were trying to identify opportunities and barriers to healthy food and play in this particular community. So one final example, just to give you a sense of some of the diversity of qualitative research approaches. This image is a piece of data from a paper published in the journal Medical Humanities by Cyril Cristancho and Tara Fenwick. It's an example of the rich picture method, where participants are asked to first draw a picture and then explain it to the interviewer. The researchers analyze both the content of the interview, which is now richer because the participant has engaged in an exercise of thinking about the complexity of whatever the issue is that they're being asked to discuss. But the researchers also analyze the ideas as they're represented pictorially, whether it's about patterns or colors or metaphors or symbols. They look at the pictures that an individual makes, but then they also analyze across the collection of images. So the image that you're looking at right now comes from a research study on the topic of becoming a surgeon, where the word becoming refers to the development of professional capability, confidence, and identity. And I'm going to read you a little bit of an excerpt of the analysis of this photo. If you're interested in learning more, you can seek out this paper in the Medical Humanities Journal. So Cristancho and Fenwick write that this map created by the participant recalls a key idea from Deleuze that experience in practice is composed of simultaneous fragments. The participant represented the surgery as different moments from multiple situations, not as a sequence of events comprising one situation. No particular moment had a single line of narrative. Instead, it was an assemblage of different material fragments, metaphors, tangled conflicts, and effective forces that moved in and out of the surgeon's recollection of the situation. So hopefully those examples give you a bit of a sense of the richness and the diversity of qualitative research. Even within something as straightforward as an interview or a focus group, there are so many different approaches and techniques that can be used. So this brings us to the next and perhaps the most important question. What is the point of this technique? Why might you choose to conduct or to read a qualitative research study? I think first we need to start with acknowledging that qualitative research holds different assumptions and it uses different methods to answer different types of questions than quantitative research. So I think for a long time there was sort of set up this, this dichotomy, which could often be sort of adversarial about what's better, qualitative or quantitative. And really, if you take away anything from this video, the message that I hope that you take away is that they just take different approaches to answering different questions. You can't use qualitative to answer a question about the effects that a particular drug has on a particular sort of set of symptoms. It's just not what it's for. So it's not about better or worse. It's about more appropriate, less appropriate for the questions that you have in front of you. So if I was going to sort of sum up the entire field in a couple of points, I would say that qualitative research tries to either generate, expand, refine theory using an inductive approach to reasoning. It emphasizes the ways in which individuals interpret the social world that they live in, and really is most interested in participant descriptions and understandings of human behavior. Qualitative research strives for careful and detailed descriptions or interpretations of social practices in order to understand how participants experience and explain their own world. You might find a qualitative approach helpful if the research question that you have concerns something that cannot be measured. For instance, if you're interested in the opinions, the experiences, or the beliefs of participants. A qualitative approach might be suitable if you're not sure exactly what information you need to answer the question. So maybe you don't know what factors are important or how they should be measured, or how they could be measured, or what stakeholder groups are really relevant here. Qualitative research can also be important when the boundaries or the parameters of the question are still broad and might need exploration within the data collection process itself. And this is because qualitative research asks different types of questions. So here's a couple of examples of questions that would be, I think, well suited to a qualitative approach. So why don't patients take the medications as we prescribe and recommend them? Or what makes a particular clinical teaching unit an effective place to learn? Or what outcomes matter most to patients experiencing a particular health condition or intervention? Qualitative research can also be used to explain unexpected findings. So here's an example, and the citations are at the bottom. So first, we did a prospective cohort study to identify the psychological, physical, social predictors of excess gestational weight gain. And the findings from that study, which were published in PLOS1, were that we found 9 variables which predicted excess gestational weight gain, and they were nulliparity, being overweight, planning to gain in excess of the guidelines, eating in front of a screen, having a low sense of self-efficacy around weight gain, having an agreeable personality, having emotional control difficulties, being surrounded by friends and family who believe that pregnant people should eat twice as much as before pregnancy. So this is sort of a eclectic collection of variables that were predicting excess gestational weight gain. And some of them make sense, like planning to gain in excess for sure, that makes sense that you would if that's what your plan was, but it still doesn't really help us from a clinical perspective to understand how to intervene with folks who are planning to gain in excess. There's also, I think, a few variables in here which we don't really know why that predicts excess gestational weight gain. So for instance, never having given birth before, why does that mean that you're going to gain more? Or having an agreeable personality. We did find that personal endorsement of the idea that a pregnant person should eat twice as much was not associated with actual gain in excess. It was when family and friends endorsed that idea that it was predictive. So then we embarked on a qualitative study where we aimed to explain the relevance of these factors by talking to pregnant people about how they make and enact decisions about weight gain. And this was really helpful in terms of explaining some. We weren't able to explain all of these. We had to focus on just a few. But explaining some of these variables. For example, we found that those who plan to gain in excess of the guidelines typically didn't understand that they were planning to gain in excess. They just picked the wrong BMI category, and that's why their goal was too high. Here's another example, and this is ongoing hematology-related research that I'm involved in. So led by Chris Hillis and Nancy Heddle at McMaster University, we're doing a 3-step project where we are trying to address the problem that trial outcomes typically don't include patient perspectives about what's important, and so then potentially miss the mental, social, or personal impacts of whatever the intervention is that's being studied. And in particular, around acute myeloid leukemia, there's not a lot of patient perspectives about outcomes related to treatment for AML, particularly around bleeding. And so the entire project aims to develop a composite outcome which incorporates patient perspectives, but also incorporates clinical evidence and clinician perspectives. But part of what we're doing through this is we're doing a qualitative study of patients who've undergone induction chemotherapy for AML, about the types of bleeding that they experienced and how they understood or interpreted those different types of bleeding. So just to help you further understand some of the distinctions between qualitative and quantitative approaches, here's a little bit of a chart. So qualitative strives to describe or interpret research rather than quantitative, which tries to offer an explanation. Qualitative relies more on an inductive mode of reasoning as opposed to deductive. More interested in meaning than numbers. In terms of data, we're striving for depth and uniqueness rather than generalizability. Philosophically, we believe in the existence of multiple ways of seeing the truth or understanding the world rather than just one single way. We tend to address problems or whatever we're studying in a holistic rather than a reductionistic way. So we're interested in context and all of the different potential factors rather than trying to eliminate all the factors so that we can study one particular one and really understand that one very well. Qualitative approaches are more likely to develop than to test theory, more interested in the process rather than the outcomes when we talk about rigor of the research, and tend to offer rich descriptions rather than precise measurement of a phenomenon. So I've mentioned a couple of times that the reasoning related to qualitative is inductive. And so mostly this is because we start a qualitative research project with a more tentative idea about what's important at the beginning. We don't know maybe all of the factors that are relevant to whom, in what proportion or at what level. These are all of the things that we're starting to try to find out. And we want to enter the research in a way that allows the participants to identify what's important to them rather than to impose the assumptions of the researcher about what's important. So how I frame this to my graduate students when they're designing interview guides or designing a project is that you want to create room to be surprised by what you hear from your participants. You want to make sure that that interview guide is eliciting whatever it's the priorities, opinions, beliefs very widely so that you're not saying, is this, that, or the other the most important thing. You're just asking them, what's the most important thing here? And this is, I think, the biggest difference between sort of a survey approach or a measurement approach, where the researcher needs to think of options and they need to ask the participant to respond to what they've already come up with, rather than kind of leaving it open and letting the participants provide that information. With inductive reasoning, what we're doing here is we're being exploratory. We don't know what we're looking for. We're collecting a whole bunch of different pieces of data, and then we're trying to look for patterns or ideas to bring it up to the level of theory, rather than starting with the theory and then trying to test that so that we could explain the data-driven observations. And part of the way that we do this is that in most qualitative methodologies, the methods evolve as you collect data. So you collect a little bit of data, you analyze that, you maybe identify something that's interesting or important. And so then you change your data collection strategy. You maybe talk to a person who you think would be particularly likely to be able to shed light on this idea. Maybe you add a different question to your interview guide, but you sort of work it in this iterative or in this back and forth way between data collection and analysis to make sure that you're narrowing your focus as the project progresses in response to initial data. So now I'm going to talk about some of the essential components of a qualitative research project, or what a good qualitative research project would include. And I think that these elements are really present in all research projects. It doesn't matter what the topic is or what the approach is, but we'll talk about them particularly in relevance to what your qualitative toolkit would hold. So I think the very first thing is to think about the philosophical assumptions. And every single project, no matter what the research approach, has these assumptions about what exists, what we can know about what exists, and how we can go about gathering that information. But I think that in more quantitative or experimental forms of research, there's everybody's sort of working within the same philosophical assumptions, a more positivist, post-positivist way of thinking that there's one reality and we can know it through precise and refined measurement. But in qualitative research, folks do use that orientation, but there's also lots of researchers that use a more interpretivist or more critical or perhaps a pragmatic orientation to how different people understand the world. And I think this also reflects the types of phenomenon that each approach studies, right? When we're studying people's perspectives or people's beliefs, it's I think it's easy to understand why there wouldn't just be one way of thinking about medication adherence, or why we may or may not take medications as prescribed, right? Everybody's life has different circumstances, different resources, different understandings of the disease that they have, of their body, of what the medication's doing, different experiences with the side effects of that medication, and how all of these things kind of fit together within the context of their family and their work and their financial resources and their literacy level and everything else that's happening for that person. So in this respect, taking a view that there are multiple different realities and multiple different ways that people are navigating the same phenomenon can make a lot of sense. If you're interested in learning what these epistemology, ontology, methodology words really mean, here's a couple of useful papers. The next part, and so I'm going to say the second most important, or the second thing that you sort of start thinking about, is the methodology. So a methodology is a package of guidance about how to do qualitative research. It typically is aligned with a particular philosophical paradigm or often within a particular academic discipline. And it offers to researchers guidance about data collection, data analysis, criteria for ensuring quality. And so sort of gives you the map that you need to embark on this journey. And your research question, every research project has a research question, right? Qualitative is no different. And the research question is going to guide your inquiry. It needs to be congruent with the methodology. In some methodologies, they have a particular focus. And so in that respect, you want to make sure that the methodology you pick is appropriate for your question. But often in practice, these two elements, the methodology and the research question, evolve iteratively. Each kind of informs another. So for example, maybe you choose the methodology of phenomenology, which is really focused on the essence of lived experience. So then you're going to need to write a research question about lived experience. You can't embark on a phenomenological project about, for instance, social interaction. It's just not congruent. In some methodologies, the research question shifts over the course of the inquiry as that iterative data collection analysis process that I spoke about a few moments ago leads to a refined understanding of the phenomenon. In others, you start out with your a priori research question, and that remains the same throughout. Within that methodology, you're going to need to make a data collection and analysis plan. And this is where we get into all of the different types of data collection that I started the presentation out with. Are you speaking with people? Are you observing them? Are you asking them to create some sort of art that you will then talk with them about? The methodology guides the options that are available to you and how to operationalize them. So even within the idea of an interview, there's so many different ways of doing an interview, a semi-structured interview, a narrative interview, an unstructured interview, all kinds of different options. We can think of the methodology here as the menu. The menu tells you what's available, but there's still a lot of choices that you need to make within that menu. You need to choose what you're going to order. There's possibilities to modify or to make special requests about each dish that you might ask of the kitchen. But still importantly, there's a limit to the type of modifications that are acceptable. So if we want to continue this menu or food metaphor, we can imagine that if you're having a meal at a Greek restaurant, you might say, I'd rather have rice instead of potatoes for this particular dish. And the kitchen is probably quite happy to make that substitution. But if you asked them for spaghetti or for a roti, like less possible, they're going to say, no, that doesn't fit. We're not able to do this. It's not going to be delicious. So similarly, when you're designing your research project, the methodology describes a variety of ways that you might collect data, and it's up to you to pick and choose the data collection methods that best fit your research question and the suppositions about what will yield the richest and most feasible data. But it's not an unlimited menu that's available to you. There's some guidance from the methodology about what you can do here, what's going to fit with the philosophical assumptions of that methodology, with the analytic techniques. Within data collection, we can think about sampling and recruitment. And this is really about how you're going to locate the data. So often when we talk about sampling and recruitment, we're talking about people. What kind of people do you want to talk to or observe? How are you going to identify them? How are you going to invite them to participate? Is this strategy going to change as the project progresses and analysis proceeds? But this idea also works for projects where the data doesn't come from people. So we might sample documents, we sample cases in a case study. It's really here the idea is about choosing rich and relevant data. And in qualitative research, we don't try for a representative sample, right? Instead, we aim for a sample which will yield rich and relevant data to help answer the question under consideration. And there's a whole bunch of different sampling techniques that one could use. Many qualitative researchers will start out with a convenience or a maximum variation sample, and then proceed more theoretically, identifying and recruiting participants to fill gaps in the data or to test emerging insights. Analysis is also part of this, and so many different ways of analyzing qualitative data, but really very specific to each methodology. So I haven't made a slide about that. But I think that the final aspect to consider as a qualitative researcher is the role of the researcher. So your role, the role of the team in that research. And this is really closely linked to the philosophical assumptions and the methodological traditions. So most qualitative research approaches understand that the researcher is the instrument of the research. And so there's very clear guidelines about how to consider the knowledge that is co-created between the researcher and the participants, and instructions about examining the influence that you as the researcher have on the knowledge that's generated. There are a few qualitative methodologies that take a more post-positivist approach and instruct the researcher to sort of bracket out their influence on the work. And that's more closely aligned with how we think of the role of the researcher in quantitative research. But it's atypical. There's just kind of a few qualitative approaches that use that. And so when we're thinking about what the role of the researcher is, you might have heard the terms reflexivity or positionality before, and these are really about the idea that the researcher influences the research and that it's impossible not to, and that this happens everywhere. We're just maybe more likely to acknowledge it in qualitative research. So we can think about the researcher's influence across all different kinds of projects in the way that researchers have to make decisions about what questions to ask, what funding to pursue, what outcomes or thresholds to define, eligibility criteria. These are all decisions that have to be made in every project and which will influence the results or the knowledge that's creative. Qualitative researchers, I think, have an additional layer of influence in how participants respond to them during interviews. So people are always making choices about what information to share or how to frame something. And I think that often those choices are made perhaps subconsciously, but in direct response to who the person is that they're speaking with. And also during analysis, the analyst needs to make a lot of decisions about what analytic ideas to follow, how different ideas are connected, what vague words mean, lots of decision making there. So what reflexivity is it's a way of acknowledging this influence and trying to be transparent about aspects of one's personal identity or one's experiences that influence those decisions. So I'm going to give you an example. So this is an example of a study. This was one of my master's students. Shantae DeFreitas is one of my master's students. And she led a study about the experiences of aspiring physicians who come from low-income backgrounds and what it's like to sort of work through the pre-medical and medical admissions process. So we had a whole team of folks involved in this. And as a team, we needed to be clear with each other and transparent about our own what we're bringing to the research and relevant to this topic. We talked about our own aspirations to becoming physicians, our own income backgrounds, the process of navigating the pre-medical process and applying to medical school for those who did do that. And we also really made sure to assemble a team where we had a variety of perspectives. So of the 6 of us, we have 1 medical student, 1 practicing physician, 1 undergraduate student who's currently aspiring to medicine, 1 student who had previously aspired to medicine, been declined when she applied, and so then shifted her professional focus. 1 faculty member who earlier in her career had been admitted to medical school but decided against it because she couldn't afford it, and 1 faculty member who never aspired to be a physician. That one was me. Of the 6 of us, 4 of us come from low-income backgrounds, and 4 of us identify as being members of other groups who've been historically excluded from medicine. Specifically, we have a couple of researchers who identify as Black and lesbian, and we all identify as women. So other relevant experiences, like we spent a long time thinking about what informs our thinking about this. So 2 of us have made medical school admissions policy and been directly involved in both the policy, but also the instrumental decisions about who gains entrance to medical school in our admission. And 2 of us have made admissions policies about other graduate and professional programs. So as we worked as a team on this study, we had to grapple with what that meant, what our own identities and trajectories meant for how we prioritized ideas in the planning, the analysis, and the writing of the work. And we thought very carefully about who was going to do the interviews and how participants might respond to them. So the 3 faculty members who are Daniel Mountjoy and Van Stone, we did not do interviews because we thought that would be intimidating, and also because 2 of us are involved in medical school admissions that we have a degree of power influence that we wanted to try to remove. The lead researcher, DeFreitas, kept a reflexive journal where she talked. She wrote about sort of her insights and experiences as the project progressed, and particularly reflecting them against other things that had happened in her professional trajectory and different aspects of her identity, and then had regular conversations about these insights with her supervisor, with me, as the project progressed. And so this sounds like a lot of work, and it was a really important part of work on this study. But when we actually came to the manuscript, it boiled down to like a very concise statement, right? And I think that this is pretty normal, right? We in all research we're doing a lot that we're not writing about, and we're really having to make decisions about what are the most sort of important or salient aspects of the project. And the word limits of manuscripts mean that sometimes we have to apply these or describe these very, very briefly. And so this sort of harkens back to a challenge with all research in general, I think, about trying to represent the complexity of thought and planning that goes on. And I've outlined a whole number of different important components of qualitative research, all of which have a lot of options within them and even more decisions about how to operationalize those particular options. And we can't write about how to do all of these, right? There's a lot of decisions to be made on the ground. I think that oftentimes when I meet novice researchers and new students and whatnot, they're sort of looking for a recipe book about if I do this and then I do that, then it's going to be a good research project. But I'm not sure that that's possible. There's just a lot of, as with any complex project, a lot of deliberation and thoughtfulness that needs to go into the individual planning. But one of the important takeaway messages here is that all of these different elements have to work together. And a big part of that planning work that you're doing is making sure that every decision you make is congruent and compatible with the other elements that are included. And of course, feasibility and time and resources, these also change the elements that we choose and how we apply them, but still we sort of need to keep this principle of congruency together. And then the final idea that I'm going to talk about is about how to read or appraise qualitative research. And I think that this goes back to the idea that I just shared around there's a lot of stuff that happens that doesn't get written about in the paper that we sort of have to imagine what's gone on or trust that the researchers have followed the methodological guidelines. And that I think gets kind of contentious when we start doing critical appraisal of qualitative research in a way that's unique and a bit different from critical appraisal in other disciplines. So critical appraisal, I'm sure you're familiar with. This is an idea from evidence-based medicine, and really I think was developed in the context of causal or hypothesis testing research. There's a focus within critical appraisal on experimental design and logical inference, and it really sits on this assumption that there's a hierarchy of worse to better designs, which lead to worse to better quality evidence. So this idea that the strength of your design is directly causal of the strength of the conclusions or the findings of that work. So if we are going to appraise research, we're relying on the premises that the methods that are reported can help us understand something about the results as being true or trustworthy, or less trustworthy, less true. And this, I think, holds true for experimental hypothesis testing studies when the causal mechanism is both plausible and accounted for, but it doesn't really work for qualitative studies. So when we're reading or appraising qualitative research, there's a real challenge in just looking at the methods reported and relying on that to tell us whether or not it's a good study. And this has been a real point of debate in amongst the qualitative research field. There's a lot of differences of opinion about qualitative researchers about whether or not it's possible for an outside reader to accurately appraise qualitative research. So Norman Denzin, who's a famous qualitative methodologist, has given some names and descriptions to the different arguments that are made here. So there's a non-foundationalist camp that says that it's absolutely impossible to evaluate qualitative research with a priori standardized criteria. And then on the opposite side, we have the foundationalist camp, which says it is definitely possible to evaluate all research, and all research should stand up to the same criteria, the hierarchy of evidence, the pyramid. And then in the middle, which I think is where most qualitative researchers sit, We have the quasi-foundationalist camp who say, okay, like, yeah, we can evaluate, we can appraise qualitative research. It requires its own criteria, and sometimes those criteria have to be quite flexible. And within this camp, there's differences of opinion about what those criteria should be, if the same criteria should be applied to all different types of qualitative research, if each methodology should have its own criteria. So there's still some muddiness even in that middle. And this is something that I've written about before, and I'll situate myself for you as sitting very firmly in that quasi-foundationalist camp and really appreciating the flexibility of qualitative guidelines, which allow for the expert judgment of the appraiser rather than trying to fit very diverse sets of studies into a singular list of quality criteria. And here's why. I'm going to try to convince you here. So let's think of a metaphor of bread making. So with quantitative research, we could think of this as making a loaf of bread in a reliable bread machine, and relying on the assumption that if we have the same ingredients and the same recipe and the same machine, then the baker is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you're using the same recipe and you're putting the same ingredients in the same machine, and the altitude is the same, and the composition of the flour, et cetera, then the loaf of bread should always be identical. That person who's like loading up the ingredients, unless they make a mistake, they're irrelevant. As long as they follow the recipe adequately and they do what they're supposed to do, that could be anybody standing in there. And so with this assumption, we have the assumption that if we know about the design and the procedures, we can tell you about the quality of that loaf of bread, because the researchers are relevant. It's supposed to be replicable. And so all we need to know is about the design and the procedures. Qualitative, it's a bit different. We're no longer in the bread factory. Now we are making an artisanal sourdough baguette. And we now, in this field, believe that we could give a whole bunch of people exactly the same ingredients in the same oven, but we're going to get a wide variety of outcomes. We could get everything from like a perfect loaf of bread to Play-Doh. So here the assumption is that same ingredients, same recipe, vastly different results because of the influence of the baker, the sort of the localness, the contextual aspect of qualitative research. And so we can ask questions about the procedures, so the ingredients, the recipe, and we can appraise the answers that we get, but that only really tells us a fraction of what was actually done or how the findings developed. And it might be necessary, but it's never sufficient for a high quality project. So I gave you the example a couple minutes ago about all of the work that Shantae's team did to think about reflexivity in that project. And it just kind of boiled down to like a small paragraph in the manuscript. So what do I think that an external appraiser would be able to appraise about the way that we engaged in reflexivity? Like, I mean, that we did it, but not really anything about the quality of those efforts or the impact of those efforts. So here, I think that we also can think about the standards for procedural reporting in qualitative research. So we're starting to see, especially in some medical journals, which really ascribe to a critical appraisal or evidence-based medicine model, a reliance on reporting guidelines, and reporting guidelines definitely do exist for qualitative research, but they're not used that widely. So outside of the medical journals, don't see those reporting guidelines used very much. And I think that that's because the experienced qualitative researchers know that the procedures are not sufficient, right? You can follow really great procedures, but still get not such a great product. There's sort of this intangible analytic prowess of how you put ideas together and whether that results in something that's original or useful or resonates with other people who've had similar experiences. And really, you see the last bullet point here says the proof is in the eating. I think that that's also true. Like, you've got to read the paper and think about, like, does this make sense? Is it useful? Is it original? Is it credible? In order to make that judgment, that just reading the method section is not going to tell you whether or not that's a good or a useful paper. And so maybe the bottom line about appraising qualitative research is that no research project is perfect. And really, this is about thinking about the steps that they took to make it better. If the project has more strengths than weaknesses, if they acknowledge limitations, do you trust it? Is it relevant? Is it useful? Rather than, relying on the methods. So that's what I have for you, and hopefully it was useful. And yeah, happy to receive your questions or feedback by email. Thanks very much.